Whenever the name Francisco Franco is mentioned, it is usually accompanied by a list of notorious names, such as Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Joseph Stalin, and tyrants like Pol Pot, François Duvalier, Idi Amin, and Augusto Pinochet. Although General Franco shared traits of autocratic rule and despotism with these figures, he is distinguished by ending his lengthy dictatorship in an unusual way that one might not expect from a tyrant often cited as an example of repression. Today's episode is about the reference point for tyranny and a guide to dictatorship. We discuss Francisco Franco, the hero of the Spanish Civil War and the builder of modern Spain. Francisco Franco belonged to a family that had served for 6 consecutive generations in the Spanish Navy. Since the early 18th century, the Bahamonde family of Andalusian origin provided its men as officers in the Spanish fleet. His father, Nicolás Franco, was an officer in the administration corps of the Spanish Navy in the late 19th century when he fathered Francisco. However, Nicolás was a selfish and eccentric man, and his relationship with Francisco was very poor. In contrast, Francisco's mother, Maria, was a respectable and deeply religious woman from a good family, adhering to the Roman Catholic faith. Thus, Francisco was closer to her than to his father, who eventually abandoned his family and married another woman in Madrid when Francisco was just 14 years old. From then on, the relationship between father and son was virtually severed. From his childhood, Francisco Franco was a serious and disciplined person. It was expected that he would join the Spanish fleet like his ancestors, but it seems he wanted to escape his father's legacy. Therefore, he decided to join the Spanish Infantry Academy in Toledo at the age of 14, the same year his father abandoned him and his mother. Joining the army was a more logical choice since the once formidable Spanish fleet was left with little but memories after losing most of its strength in the Spanish-American War of 1898. Francisco Franco graduated from the Infantry Academy in 1910 as a second lieutenant at only 17 years old. However, the Spain into which Franco was commissioned was experiencing a persistent crisis that had lasted for 2 centuries. In the 16th century, Spain was the foremost global power in Europe, with its colonies in the Americas, especially Mexico and Peru, providing it with hundreds of tons of gold and silver. But in the 17th century, the Spanish Empire began to decline, and its revenues from the colonies decreased. By the 18th century, Spain had become a second-tier power with a struggling economy, further hampered by the dominant influence of the Roman Catholic Church and weak royal leadership. At the dawn of the 19th century, independence movements in Latin America and Central America began to diminish Spain's colonies, and at the same time, Spain came under the influence of Napoleonic France. This opened the door to a reform movement led by a new generation of Spanish politicians aimed at reforming the economy and society. This reform movement resulted in a new constitution for Spain in 1812, but tensions continued with Spain, increasing the conflict between reformists and conservatives until the outbreak of the First Spanish Civil War, known as the First Carlist War, which lasted from 1833 to 1840 and was primarily about a succession dispute. 2 more civil wars occurred in the same century in the 1840s and 1870s, the Second and Third Carlist Wars, which also revolved around the same conflict line. Thus, when Franco was born in 1892, Spain had been experiencing nearly a century of disturbances and civil wars between left-leaning liberals who wanted to limit the power of the aristocracy and the Catholic Church, and right-leaning conservatives who wanted to preserve the traditional structure of Spanish society. These 2 political forces entered the 20th century amidst ongoing disputes and tensions, setting the political backdrop for Franco's upbringing. When Francisco Franco graduated from the Infantry Academy in Toledo in 1910, Spain's military problems were confined or focused in North Africa, where the last remnants of the crumbling empire were located after losing its Caribbean and Philippine colonies in the late 19th century. Specifically, Morocco was the focus of Spanish colonial activity. Spain had colonies in Morocco for centuries, and its interests in the region expanded after it extended its colony in the Spanish-Moroccan War of 1859 and 1860, and after its brief conflicts with Moroccan tribes in 1893 and 1909. Each victory over the tribes meant an expansion of its colonies in Morocco. In November 1912, Spain gained control over a larger area of Morocco after a partition agreement made with France, whereby Spain acquired territories on the northern Moroccan coast and other areas in the south. France controlled the richer and more valuable central part of Morocco. Despite the agreement with France, Spain remained engaged in its conflict with the Moroccan tribes throughout the second decade of the 20th century, which is the period when Francisco Franco volunteered to serve in Morocco in 1912, at the age of just 19. A year after beginning his service, Franco was promoted to first lieutenant in one of the elite regiments of the Moroccan cavalry. He became known for his seriousness, discipline, and leadership skills despite his young age, as well as for his care for his soldiers and their affection for him. In 1915, he was promoted to captain, becoming the youngest captain in the entire Spanish army, but within less than a year, he was shot in the stomach and had to return to Spain, where he remained until the creation of the Spanish Foreign Legion, of which Franco was appointed as the deputy commander. This position brought him back to North Africa in the early 1920s. Fortunately for him, a new war broke out between the Spanish and the Berber tribes in the Rif Mountains of Morocco, a conflict that lasted 5 years from 1921 to 1926. During this war, Franco was promoted to command the Legion, specifically in 1923, the year he married Maria del Carmen Polo, who bore him his only daughter. Also, in the same year, Franco was summoned to Madrid to meet with King Alfonso XIII of Spain, a meeting that indicated the fame Franco had achieved during his military service in Morocco and a time when the army's power in Spanish politics was rising. King Alfonso XIII acknowledged the coup staged by General Miguel Primo de Rivera in September 1923, who then led the Spanish government for 7 years under the motto Patria, Religion, Rey, Fatherland, Religion, King. In North Africa, Francisco Franco was a key reason for Spain's victory in the Rif War, and his reputation and fame in his country grew immensely, marking him as a national hero. In February 1926, he was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 33, making him the youngest general in any European army at that time. In 1928, he was appointed director of the General Military Academy in Zaragoza. His reputation as a national hero, following his military achievements in North Africa and his relationships with the officers who graduated under his guidance at the academy, would later become a very important tool in his future and life. Now we come to the most important event in our entire story, the Civil War that ended with Franco taking power in Spain. The Civil War ignited due to an event that occurred in 1930 when General Miguel Primo de Rivera, whom we just mentioned, was forced to resign amid a severe economic crisis in Spain and due to the Spanish populace's anger towards his policies. This was in late January 1930. In April 1931, and after 15 months of political unrest, municipal elections were held in Spain. The Republicans won more than 40% of the votes compared to about 25% for the monarchists, something that was considered a referendum on King Alfonso XIII himself, indicating that the people did not want him, a message he understood as meaning that the municipal election results were a referendum on his kingship. 2 days after the elections, on the night of April 14, 1931, King Alfonso XIII left the country without abdicating the throne, and on the same day, the establishment of the Spanish Republic was officially announced, ending the era of monarchy and beginning a new epoch in Spain. Of course, the new leadership began making many changes in politics and the economy, and intervened in the roles of the church and the army, which had been tools of the king in governance. Because Franco was among the monarchists and had been linked to King Alfonso XIII's rule, the Republicans removed him from the leadership of the Zaragoza Military Academy, dissolved the academy itself, and assigned him a trivial command, even though he had no objections to working with the new regime. Franco remained in the shadows during the early years of the Spanish Republic, which experienced many disturbances, including coup attempts and regional and internal unrest. In 1933, elections were held, and the Spanish Confederation of the Autonomous Right won, meaning a return for Franco to leadership positions and his promotions to Major General in 1934. In October of the same year, he was appointed to lead the operation to suppress a miners' uprising in the Asturias region, who were opposing the return of the conservatives to power, while Franco himself saw it as a communist uprising aiming to destroy civilization in Spain itself. Based on his success in this operation, Franco was appointed chief of the general staff of the Spanish army. After a series of scandals in the mid-1930s, the parliament was dissolved, and new elections were called for in February 1936. The rightists immediately began planning a coup, and right-wing elements contacted Franco as an honorable military man with no party loyalties. The atmosphere at the time was charged with disputes and polarizations between the left-wing bloc of communists and socialists fervent for the republic and the right-wing bloc that included monarchists, conservatives, and devout Catholics, a bloc that had the majority of loyalty among the top military leadership and the military administrations in Spain's colonies in North Africa. Despite the strength of the right-wing alliance, the leftists won the 1936 elections. Manuel Azaña, the leader of the Republican left, was quickly appointed head of a new leftist government. The first thing this government did, of course, was to exile Franco to the Canary Islands and appoint him a military commander there, obviously to keep him away from Spain itself. After weeks of contact, Franco agreed to join them in the project to overthrow the leftists from power. The agreement was that 3 people would lead the coup. General José Sanjurjo, who was exiled in Portugal, would be the symbolic president of the coup. Emilio Mola Vidal, Duke of Mola, would be the operation's leader in Spain itself, and General Francisco Franco would lead the rebellion of the Spanish colonial armies in North Africa. The Civil War began on July 17, 1936, a day earlier than the agreed and scheduled date because the Spanish army in Morocco rebelled early. The following day, Franco flew from the Canary Islands to North Africa, while the rebel forces took control of large areas of Spain. By the end of July, the coup plotters, who called themselves the nationalists, had taken control of the North African colonies and the cities of Zaragoza, Seville, Cordoba, Valladolid, and Badajoz, while the government forces and their supporters, who called themselves the Republicans, controlled the major cities, including the capital Madrid, Barcelona, Bilbao, Malaga, and Valencia. With each side controlling a part of the country, it seemed that the conflict was on its way to becoming a long and bitter struggle. The Republicans, with their socialist affiliations, received support from the Soviet Union, while the nationalists received support from Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler and the fascist regime in Italy under Benito Mussolini. The other major countries declared their neutrality ostensibly, but opened the door for the recruitment of militias from their citizens like Britain, the United States, and France, and thus the Spanish Civil War turned into a miniature global war and a proxy for the great powers, and also became a field for testing the new weapons developed by these powers after World War I. For example, the first appearance of the German Panzer I tank in combat was in the Spanish Civil War. The first appearance of the Soviet BT-5 tank was also in the Spanish Civil War. The encounters between these two tanks in Spain led to significant developments in tank manufacturing in Germany and in the Soviet Union. As expected, the war lasted longer than planned. In June 1937, Franco was declared the general commander of the Nationalist Army and then the supreme commander of the Nationalists after the deaths of Emilia Mola and José Sanjurjo in separate plane accidents. In the same year, Franco founded the Spanish Phalanx, a fascist anti-communist party supportive of the Roman Catholic Church. The Phalanx was a merger of a group of right-wing and devout Catholic factions. Starting from the summer of 1937, Francisco Franco became the sole leader of the nationalists, and the war continued more violently and fiercely, showing how ruthless Franco could be. On March 28, 1939, the nationalists entered Madrid, and 2 days later, all of Spain was under their control, and thus under the control of Francisco Franco after the war ended. Franco opened the gates of hell on the remnants of the Republicans, executing at least 30,000 people in the first weeks of his rule, in addition to tens of thousands of detainees and hundreds of thousands who fled Spain to Latin America and France and elsewhere. This situation continued for years during Franco's rule. Franco promised to rebuild Spain after the end of the Civil War, but he couldn't because World War II ignited, sparked by his ally Adolf Hitler after he invaded Czechoslovakia, annexed Austria, and then invaded Poland. Of course, Hitler and Mussolini had supported the nationalists in the Spanish Civil War and helped Franco come to power, and it was expected that Franco would join their alliance when they declared war and fight alongside them. But what happened was different. Franco declared his neutrality. Initially, he argued that Spain was exhausted and had no capacity to enter the war as it had just emerged from a long civil war. But when German forces achieved crushing victories, especially with the invasions of Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France in the early weeks of the summer of 1940, Franco hinted to Hitler that he might join the war with him. But negotiations between Hitler and Franco did not yield results because Franco demanded, in exchange for his entry into the war, that Spain receive supplies and aid from Germany, and also obtain sovereignty over British Gibraltar and France's colonies in North Africa. During the rest of World War II, Franco followed a very exploitative policy and played all sides. He allowed the formation of Spanish militias to fight alongside the Germans, but stipulated that they fight on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, not against France, which he was afraid to get involved in a war with, along with its ally Britain. At the same time, he kept Spanish forces stationed on the border with occupied France, fearing that Hitler might invade Spain at any time if he needed its territory as strategic locations for his forces. After the end of World War II, Spain, under Franco's rule, entered a period of stability that Spain had not seen since the 18th century. Franco was a despot, there was no debate about that, but we cannot consider his rule to be fascist in the sense that applies to Mussolini's Italy or Hitler's Germany. His true classification is that of a conservative nationalist military dictatorship, a current that Franco did not invent or import to Spain from abroad. It was a current that was already present and active in Spain since the 19th century. Additionally, Franco's regime went through many phases and transformations during his rule. It could be classified as fascist during the years of World War II, but afterward, it was a conservative, nationalist military dictatorship. Because not all nationalist regimes in the world are the same, Franco's nationalism strongly supported the role of the Catholic Church, a rarity for nationalists to support a religious institution or to receive its support. These two sides rarely meet. Of course, a few years into Franco's rule, freedoms began to return one by one, and the state became more open, and the pursuit of opponents greatly diminished. But this was not because Franco suddenly became a kind man. It was because he had actually eliminated all forms of opposition domestically, and there was no one left to pursue or chase. Finally, Spain's economy improved after nearly half a century on the brink of bankruptcy, and starting from the 1950s, it achieved a huge economic growth spurt, so much so that the last 15 years of General Franco's rule were called the Spanish Miracle, with economic growth rates second only to Japan. Spain transitioned from an underdeveloped economy to become the 9th largest economy in the world during Franco's era. But the strangest action you might expect from someone described as a dictator? The weird thing Franco did was that he sought to restore the monarchy to Spain, not that he wanted to be king himself, but that he restored the royal family. He achieved this in 1969 by bringing in a young man from the former royal family named Juan Carlos, whom he appointed as his successor and declared him prince. In 1973, Franco resigned from his position as leader of Spain and prime minister after holding free elections, becoming the first and only tyrant in history to voluntarily relinquish power and restore democracy after 34 years of solitary rule. Then he passed away peacefully in 1975. Here's an additional fact about Franco. The biggest club in the capital was called Madrid Sporting Club, and because King Alfonso XIII supported it, and it was named Real Madrid, meaning the Royal Club of Madrid, and this was in 1920. After Francisco Franco's victory in the Civil War, Real Madrid became the state's club and had preferential treatment, receiving support and backing according to most sports historians. The traditional rival of Real Madrid is FC Barcelona, a club owned by its thousands of members who belong to the Catalonia region, which seeks independence from Spain, and the second rival, Athletic Bilbao, belongs to the Basque region, which also wants to retain its cultural distinctiveness. During Franco's era, he viewed Spain as a centrally mixed state of races and languages, with no room for differences in language, culture, or identity. All of the above, dear viewer, is an introduction so I can tell you about the Di Stefano incident. Alfredo Di Stefano, an Argentine player who played for River Plate and was playing for a Colombian team called Millonarios, played a friendly match in Spain and enchanted the audience. This player was the miracle of the age, something like Lionel Messi today. Importantly, FC Barcelona contacted the player and requested to sign him, and the player was very receptive, but suddenly the deal fell through, and suddenly Di Stefano was signing for Real Madrid, becoming their superstar and known as the Blonde Arrow, achieving 5 consecutive European Cup titles for the club in addition to 8 league titles and a cup title, and scoring more than 300 goals, and no one knows the secret behind the failure of his deal with Barcelona. The secret is that General Franco intervened to stop the agreement between Di Stefano and Barcelona, although the player had already played a friendly match in the Catalan club's shirt and secured his signature for Real Madrid, because for Franco, if a team had to dominate Spanish football, it definitely had to be Real Madrid, not Barcelona or any other team associated with any local or non-centralized culture. This information cannot be confirmed but is conveyed by most sports historians of that era, when it was customary for the state to intervene in sports for political reasons.